Behind the impeccable public image of Dominique de Menil, heiress to an oil empire, the emblem of civilization and austere aesthetics, lay an inconsolable personal tragedy. It was the sudden and tragic death of her eldest son, Christophe, who perished in a devastating boating accident. This is not the story of an art collector using wealth to buy solace. This is the story of a mother who confronted the ultimate loss and transformed it into an eternal legacy, the creation of profound spiritual spaces where humanity could confront the silence and find solace. To understand Dominique, you must first understand that she was not a socialite in any sense of the word. She was, from the moment of her birth, an intellectual. She was born Dominique Schlumberger in Paris in 1908. This was the twilight of the Belle Époque, a glittering world of supreme, almost arrogant European cultural confidence. But her family was not the old decaying aristocracy. They were the new power. They were the power of science. Her family, the Schlumbergers, were Alsatians. They were a dynasty of brilliant, formidable physicists. Her father, Conrad Schlumberger, and her uncle Marcel were not counts or dukes. They were inventors. And in the early 20th century, they invented something that would change the world and make their family one of the wealthiest on earth. They invented a revolutionary method of using electrical measurements to map subterranean rock formations. In short, they had pioneered the scientific basis of modern oil exploration. The company they founded, Schlumberger, would become the largest, most technologically advanced oil field services company in the world. It would make their heirs, including Dominique, billionaires. But this context, the source of the money, is crucial. It was not inherited aristocratic land. It was wealth generated from the practical application of pure science. And the family's character reflected this. Dominique's childhood was not one of idle aristocratic frivolity. The Schlumbergers were not just scientists, they were devout, austere Protestants. Her mother, Louise, was a woman of deep, serious faith, a fervent feminist, and a believer in social justice. Dominique was raised in a household where ideas mattered more than parties, where books were more important than balls, and where character was infinitely more valuable than lineage. She was a product of that unique, rigorous Alsatian Protestant ethic, a world of moral seriousness, intellectual clarity, and a quiet, unshakable sense of duty. She was not raised to be a swan, a beautiful object of decoration. She was raised to be a scholar. This background explains everything about her. It explains her famous look in later life, the simple, unadorned, almost severe uniform of her clothes. It was an aesthetic of Protestant seriousness, a quiet rejection of frivolous decoration. It explains her mind. When she went to university, she went to the Sorbonne, the intellectual heart of France. And she did not study art history or literature. She enrolled to study mathematics and physics. She was a formidable, analytical mind, a woman who saw the world in terms of its underlying structures, its hidden laws. She was searching for the physics of the universe, and it was in this world of high-minded, left-bank intellectual ferment that she met the man who would be her partner in everything. He was not a fellow scientist. He was in almost every way her opposite and her perfect complement. His name was Jean de Menil. Jean, who would later anglicize his name to John, was not a Schlumberger. He was, in fact, everything her family was not. He was a French banker, an aristocrat, a baron, though he rarely used the title. And most importantly, he was a devout, almost mystical Roman Catholic. Where her world was one of Protestant rigor and scientific analysis, his was one of Catholic faith, aristocratic lineage, and a profound, intuitive, almost sensual love for the arts. He was, by all accounts, a man of immense charm and sophistication. When they met in 1930, she was the 22-year-old physics student, all angles and intellect. He was the 26-year-old banker, all grace and intuition. Their connection was not just a romance, it was a meeting of minds, a fusion of two powerful forces. Their marriage in 1931 was a formidable merger of two very different, very powerful forms of French identity. The industrial, intellectual, Protestant wealth of the Schlumbergers and the aristocratic, financial, and deeply Catholic heritage of the de Menils. From the very beginning, their shared language was art. They did not become collectors in middle age as a hobby for the rich. They began immediately. They were young, brilliant, and impossibly wealthy, living in a 1930s Paris that was the undisputed, roaring center of the art world. But their collecting, like everything in their lives, was guided by a profound philosophical quest. And this is the first great key to understanding Dominique's soul. Shortly after their marriage, Dominique, the serious Protestant scientist, made a monumental decision. She converted to Catholicism to join her husband in his faith. For a woman of her intellectual rigor, this was no mere social formality, no wifely duty. It was a deep, theological, and philosophical journey. She was searching for a system that could unite the logical universe of physics with the spiritual universe of her new husband. And she found a guide. This guide is one of the hidden figures of their story, a man who would define their entire philosophy. His name was Father Marie-Alain Couturier. Father Couturier was not a simple parish priest. He was a Dominican friar, an artist himself, and a brilliant revolutionary thinker. He held a belief that was at the time radical and almost heretical. He believed that the Catholic Church, which had once been the greatest patron of art for 1,000 years, had become culturally irrelevant. It had lost its nerve. It was commissioning sentimental plaster saint kitsch, while the true spirit of the age, the true gut-wrenching spiritual art, was being made by the great modernists. Couturier argued that the Church must, in a brave leap of faith, embrace the great living artists of the day, artists like Picasso, Matisse, and Leger, even if they were atheists. He believed that genius, regardless of its owner's personal faith, was a divine gift. He argued that a truly great, authentic work of art, by its very nature, was an expression of the sacred, a window into the divine. The path to God, he would say, is through truth and beauty. This idea struck Dominique and John de Menil like a thunderbolt. This was it. This was the unified field theory they had been searching for. It was the bridge between their two worlds. It merged John's Catholic mysticism with Dominique's intellectual search for universal truths. It gave them a mission. It gave them a theology. Their early collection, therefore, was not safe. They didn't buy fashionable impressionists or 18th century portraits. Guided by Father Couturier, they began buying the masters of the avant-garde, Picasso, Georges Braque, Fernand Léger, Henri Matisse. They saw these artists not as decorators, but as theologians. They were collecting not just art, they were collecting evidence of the human spirit's encounter with the modern world. They were, in their own way, building an ark of human genius. For 9 years, they lived this idyllic, charmed, and intellectually thrilling life. They were at the center of the Parisian art world. They had 5 children in quick succession. Their firstborn son, Christophe, followed by Adelaide, Georges, François, and Philippa. They were building a family and one of the most important private art collections in the world. Then, in 1940, their world, and the entire civilization they knew, ended. The phony war was over. The Nazi blitzkrieg smashed through the French defenses with terrifying speed. The French government fled. Paris, the city of light, was declared an open city to save it from destruction. The swastika was raised over the Eiffel Tower. This was not a distant political event. This was a life-or-death crisis. Jean de Menil, who had been serving in military intelligence, was on the Gestapo's radar. The Schlumberger family, with their vast industrial wealth and international connections, were a prime target for expropriation, and Dominique, though a devout Catholic, had Alsatian Jewish roots on her father's side. Under the new brutal racial laws of the Nazi regime, her children were in mortal danger. They had to flee. This was not a gentle, planned move to America. It was a desperate, terrifying, and chaotic escape. They had to get their 5 young children, the youngest just a baby, out of an occupied nation. The story of their flight is a harrowing one. They first fled Paris for the south of France, but with the establishment of the collaborationist Vichy regime, all of France was a trap. Their journey became a flight on foot, joining the stream of refugees trekking over the snow-capped Pyrenees Mountains into the frozen, precarious safety of neutral Spain. From there, they managed to secure passage to the New World. In 1941, the de Menil family, along with Dominique's parents, landed in America. But they did not land in the familiar, sophisticated embrace of New York City. They did not join the bustling world of fellow European émigrés like André Breton or Max Ernst, who were recreating the salons of Paris in Manhattan apartments. They could have. They had the money and the connections, but the source of that money dictated their fate. The Schlumberger Company, the engine of their fortune, was an oil prospecting firm. And in 1941, the global center of the oil world was not New York or London or Paris, it was Houston, Texas. One must pause for a moment to contemplate the sheer existential culture shock. To go from the intellectual salons of pre-war Paris, the home of Picasso, Matisse, and the Sorbonne, to Houston. In 1941, Houston was a hot, flat, humid, sprawling, mosquito-ridden boomtown. It was a city of raw, untamed capitalism, built on oil, cotton, and sheer, unapologetic grit. It was a place of wildcatters and oil barons, a city of immense newfound wealth, but with almost no cultural infrastructure to match it. It had no significant art museum, no avant-garde gallery, no symphony of note. It was, in the eyes of a Parisian intellectual, a cultural desert. Dominique, in her early letters to friends back in Europe, was in despair. She felt, as she wrote, an exile in a provincial backwater. She was a woman who lived on ideas, and she was surrounded by a world that seemed, to her, to value only money and material success. She felt isolated, bored, and profoundly, deeply homesick. They had a choice that confronts all exiles. They could have been bored, rich, expat socialites. They could have built a grand mansion, hosted lavish parties, and waited. They could have counted the days, months, and years until Hitler was defeated and they could finally return to the real world, to Paris. They could have fled the Texas heat for the more comfortable, familiar exile of New York, joining their friends. Instead, they made a monumental, life-defining decision. It was a decision rooted in Dominique's Alsatian Protestant sense of duty and in their shared, almost missionary Catholic belief in the power of art. They decided that if culture would not come to them, they would build it. They would not just live in Houston, they would transform it. If this was a desert, they would make it bloom. This was not an act of social climbing arrogance. It was an act of intellectual and spiritual survival. And it was here, in this unlikely, swampy, profoundly American city, that the de Menil legend truly began. Their first act of transformation was not a public building. It was personal. It was their home. They did not build a sprawling Texas mansion, a monument to the swaggering, oil baron aesthetic. They did not erect a French chateau in the middle of the prairie, a nostalgic, backward-looking fortress against their new environment. Instead, they hired a young, cutting-edge, and deeply intellectual architect from New York, Philip Johnson. In 1951, he completed their house in the new wealthy suburb of River Oaks. It was for Houston a radical, almost alien object. It was a long, low-slung, single-story pink brick box, built around a lush, hidden interior courtyard. It was the first and most uncompromisingly international style house in a city of mock Tudor, antebellum, and Spanish colonial fantasies. It was a quiet, elegant, and deeply intellectual statement. It said, "We are not here to blend in. We are here to set a new standard." But the real statement, the true revolution, was inside. The house was not designed for living in the conventional sense of grand, formal entertainment. It was designed for art. It was, in effect, a private, domestic-scale gallery that they also happened to live in. The rooms were minimalist, with stark white walls, travertine floors, and flexible, movable partitions. The furniture was sparse, modern, designed by Mies van der Rohe, and most importantly, movable. This is the key to understanding the de Menil philosophy. They lived in a state of constant, fluid, and active dialogue with their collection. The art was not decoration. It was the purpose of the space. It was a member of the family. A massive, vibrant painting by Fernand Léger might dominate the living room one week, only to be replaced by a collection of serene, 6,000-year-old cyclic idols the next. They moved furniture to accommodate the art, not the other way around. Their children would recall growing up in a house where the art was as alive as they were. A priceless ancient African mask was not locked behind glass. It was on a low table where a child could look it in the eyes. A delicate Paul Klee painting might hang at a child's eye level, not high on a wall. They were raised to live with genius, to treat it not with a fussy reverence, but with a familiar daily intimacy. Their home became a machine for seeing, and they used it as their first, most potent cultural weapon. They didn't just hoard their art, as so many wealthy collectors did, hiding it away in private wings. They shared it. They turned their home into the most exclusive and most important salon in Texas. Dominique, in her quiet, precise, heavily French-accented English, would personally walk guests, bemused oilmen, their wives draped in jewels, curious university students, aspiring local artists, through their collection. She wouldn't just show them a Picasso. She would teach them. She would stand before a painting, her slender frame radiating an intense, focused energy, and explain why it mattered. She would connect its lines and forms to the spiritual quest that she and John believed in so deeply. This was not a social performance. It was an act of quiet, passionate intellectual evangelism. She was a missionary, and her gospel was modern art. They didn't just bring their art, they brought the artists. They began to use the vast Schlumberger fortune to fly the great exiled figures of the European avant-garde to Houston. Max Ernst, the surrealist master, became a close friend and a frequent long-term house guest. They brought the iconoclastic filmmaker Roberto Rossellini. They brought the minimalist, revolutionary composer John Cage. They brought the dancer Merce Cunningham. Imagine the scene, imagine the cultural collision. These towering, difficult, and brilliant figures of 20th century modernism, sipping cocktails in a stark Philip Johnson house, surrounded by Picassos and ancient Byzantine icons, all in the humid, disorienting, and deeply conservative landscape of 1950s Texas. The de Menils were creating a cultural vortex, a whirlwind of ideas, and they were deliberately, methodically, pulling the entire city of Houston into it. They began their public work. They didn't start by building a monument to themselves. They started at the bottom. They found the local struggling Contemporary Arts Association, which at the time met in a small rented room and was run by volunteers. Dominique and John joined. They didn't just write a check and put their name on a letterhead. They worked, they curated, they lectured, they wrote the catalogs, they swept the floors. With their money, their energy, their connections, and their uncompromising vision, they transformed it. They helped it grow from a small club into the Contemporary Arts Museum Houston, a vital, challenging institution. They didn't just loan their art, they curated shows that were, for Houston, completely revolutionary. In 1952, they organized one of the first major U.S. exhibitions of Vincent van Gogh. This was not the beloved Van Gogh of posters and coffee mugs. This was, at the time, still a difficult, challenging, and emotionally raw artist. They brought in exhibitions of Leger and Picasso. They were, piece by piece, exhibition by exhibition, educating the eye of their new city. This was their shared philosophy in action, a quote they repeated often, one that became their motto: "Art is the shortest path from man to man." They truly, deeply believed this. They believed that a 1,000-year-old African mask, a 4,000-year-old Cycladic idol, a medieval icon of the Virgin Mary, and a brand new, challenging painting by a young New York abstract artist were all speaking the same essential human spiritual truth. They were all attempts by the human spirit to touch the face of the divine, to make sense of the mystery of our existence. And they believed that if they could just get people to look, to really see past the surface, past the style, past the shock of the new, art could be a universal language. It could bridge the gaps between faiths, between races, between cultures. It was, in their eyes, the ultimate tool for ecumenism. This was their life's work. It was a shared, joyous, intellectual, and spiritual project. They were building a new Eden in the Texas desert, a world of art, faith, and intellect. They were at the absolute height of their powers. Their 5 children, Christophe, Adelaide, Georges, Francois, and Philippa, were growing up in this extraordinary art-filled house, bilingual, brilliant, and secure. They were succeeding. Their gamble on Houston was paying off. They had turned their exile into a paradise. And then in 1957, the world that they had so meticulously, so lovingly, and so intellectually constructed was shattered. The tragedy was sudden, random, and meaningless. It was the kind of brutal existential blow that renders faith, philosophy, and art utterly powerless. Their eldest son, Christophe, was 24 years old. He was the firstborn, the heir. By all accounts, he was a bright, handsome, sensitive young man, a student at Columbia University. He was the child who had made that terrifying journey with them over the Pyrenees. He was working a summer job on the East Coast, crewing on a 19-foot boat for a friend of the family. It was a simple fishing trip off the coast of Florida. A sudden, violent, and utterly unpredictable squall blew up. The boat, which was far too small for the open water, was overwhelmed. It capsized. The other 2 men on the boat were rescued, found hours later, clinging to the overturned hull, suffering from exposure. But Christophe was gone. They searched for days, the Coast Guard, private planes funded by the frantic, desperate de Menils. They scoured the ocean. They found nothing, no trace. He had been lost at sea. This is the central, defining, unspoken grief of Dominique de Menil's life. How does a person, how does a philosopher process a loss like this? How does a mother whose entire life is built on finding order, meaning, and spiritual connection confront an event that is the very definition of chaos, meaninglessness, and a brutal final disconnection? There was no public breakdown. There was no theatrical European mourning. The de Menils, with their shared bedrock deep sense of Catholic faith, and Dominique's innate Protestant stoicism turned inward, but they did not become recluses. They did not stop. They did not retreat from the world. Instead, their work, their collecting, their public mission became everything. It was no longer just about culture. It was no longer about educating Houston. It was now a profound, desperate, existential quest. Their grief was a wound that would never, ever close. It was a vast, silent, empty space that had opened up in the center of their perfect, art-filled home. And they poured all of it, all the pain, all the unanswerable questions, all the longing into their work. Their collecting, which had always been spiritual, now became transcendent. It was no longer an intellectual exercise. It was a search for art that could speak to and about the void. It was a search for meaning in a world that had just proven to be random and cruel. This is where the user's hook, the patroness who turned faith into art, gains its true painful meaning. It was not a passive faith in art. It was an active, striving, almost desperate use of art as an act of faith. It was a way to heal. It was a way to channel their bottomless grief into something tangible, something lasting. It was a way to survive. And it was out of this profound, bottomless well of personal loss that their first and perhaps greatest masterpiece was born. They decided to build a monument, not a statue of their son, not a building with his name on it. That would have been too simple, too literal. They decided to build a space for the very grief they were feeling, a space for the modern world, a world that had lost its old gods and was searching for a new kind of sanctity. They had been following with intense interest the work of a difficult, brilliant, and deeply melancholic abstract painter in New York, Mark Rothko. Rothko was an artist who was himself on a desperate spiritual quest. He was not painting pictures. He was, as he insisted, painting emotions. He wanted his huge, abstract, hovering fields of color, deep crimsons, maroons, and blacks, to overwhelm the viewer, to create a quasi-religious experience, to bring them to tears. He was painting tragedy, ecstasy, and doom. The de Menils saw in Rothko a fellow traveler. They saw an artist who was grappling with the same profound existential questions that now haunted their lives. In 1964, 7 years after Christophe was lost at sea, Dominique and John made their move. They did not just buy a Rothko painting. They gave Mark Rothko one of the greatest, most demanding, and ultimately most destructive commissions of the 20th century. They asked him to create a total environment, a sacred space. It would be a chapel, but it would be a chapel for everyone and for no one. A non-denominational, non-sectarian space dedicated to contemplation, built on the campus of the Catholic University St. Thomas, where they were already building a new modernist campus. It would be in its essence a place for a modern person to sit with the void, a place to confront the very tragedy, ecstasy, and doom that Rothko painted, and that the de Menils now knew so intimately. The commission given to Mark Rothko in 1964 was not a simple business contract. It was a spiritual pact. It was an act of profound, almost reckless trust. Dominique and John de Menil, acting on the advice of their friend, the visionary art historian and curator Germaine McCaughey, had identified Rothko as perhaps the only living artist in the world capable of creating what they were imagining. They were not looking for decoration. They were not looking for an uplifting altarpiece. They were, in the wake of their son's death, looking for an artist brave enough to paint the darkness and to find the sacred within it. Mark Rothko was not an easy man. He was, by the mid-1960s, a figure of profound moral gravity and increasingly profound personal despair. He was a Russian Jewish immigrant, a man haunted by the pogroms of his childhood and the looming collective shadow of the Holocaust. He was a man who spoke of his paintings not in terms of color or form, but in terms of human feeling. "I am interested only in expressing basic human emotions," he famously and fiercely insisted. "Tragedy, ecstasy, doom, and if you, as you say, are moved only by their color relationships, then you miss the point." The de Menils did not miss the point. They understood with a shared intuitive clarity that Rothko was already on the same difficult path they were on. He was grappling with the great unanswerable existential questions. They saw in his art the very void that had opened in their own lives. And so they gave him the commission that every great artist since Michelangelo had dreamed of and dreaded. They gave him total, almost unheard of, creative control. "You, Mr. Rothko," they effectively said, "will not just create paintings for our chapel. You will create the chapel itself. You will determine its shape, its light, its very atmosphere. The building will be a vessel for your vision." For Rothko, this was his final great statement. It was his Sistine Chapel. He began work immediately in a vast, custom-built studio in New York, a former carriage house on 69th Street. He had the interior space built to the exact dimensions of the future chapel. He lived, ate, and slept in this space, surrounding himself with the canvases, pinning them to the walls, moving them, living with them, creating a total immersive world. This was not just painting. It was an act of architecture. He specified the shape of the building, an octagon, an 8-sided space. This was a deliberate, symbolic choice. It was not a traditional cross-shaped basilica, which was specifically Christian. It was not a circle, which was too perfect, too simple. The octagon was a form of contained, faceted, equal-pressured contemplation. It was a space with no single focal point, no altar to dictate where you must look. It was a space that was both a womb and a tomb, and he specified the light. The light, he insisted, must come from above, a single, central oculus or skylight. He did not want distracting windows looking out onto the world. He wanted the light to be a divine single source, falling onto the canvases, which he called his children. This is where the first crisis hit. The project, which was still slated for the campus of the University of St. Thomas, needed an architect to execute Rothko's vision. The de Menils' trusted friend and the architect of their own famous home, Philip Johnson, was the natural choice. But Philip Johnson was a star. He was a man of grand gestures, an ego on the scale of any great artist, and he designed a building that, in Rothko's eyes, was a betrayal. Johnson's plans were for a grand, imposing ziggurat-like structure, a monument to Philip Johnson. Rothko, who was famously paranoid and difficult, was furious. He felt Johnson's architecture was a pretentious container that would reduce his paintings to mere decoration. He wanted the paintings to be the architecture, not the building. He wanted a simple, humble, almost brutalist bunker that served the art. The de Menils were forced to choose, and in a move that shocked the architectural world and ruptured a close friendship, they made a defining choice. They sided with the artist. This was Dominique's quiet power in its purest form. Her loyalty was not to social connections, not even to the star architect who had built her home. Her loyalty was to the idea. The soul of the project was what mattered. They quietly and surely painfully removed Philip Johnson from the project. This was a clear, unambiguous statement. The artist, the visionary, the one wrestling with the truth, was the one who would lead. Two local Houston architects, Howard Barnstone and Eugene Aubrey, were brought in with the crystal clear instruction that they were to be subservient to Mark Rothko's vision. With the architectural crisis solved, the project immediately ran into its second and far greater existential crisis. The University of St. Thomas, their Catholic partners, began to get cold feet. As the final plans were drawn up, as the mood of the project became clear, the Catholic hierarchy panicked. They had imagined a bright, welcoming, modern chapel, something to celebrate the glory of God. They had perhaps imagined a new version of the chapel at Assy, the one Father Couturier had helped create with its brilliant, colorful windows by Leger. This was not that. This was dark. The canvases that Rothko was now creating in his New York studio were not the bright, ecstatic fields of yellow, red, and orange from his earlier, more famous work. They were vast, oppressive, monumental panels of bruised, near-black maroons, dark, fathomless purples, and deep, vibrating voids. The university leadership saw despair, they saw negation, they saw nihilism. They saw a space that was not, in their view, Catholic. Where was the cross? Where was the light? Where was the joy of the resurrection? This was the ultimate test of Father Couturier's philosophy, the very idea that had set the de Menils on their path. They had argued that genius was divine, even if it was atheist. But what if that genius was a genius for darkness? Was that too divine? Dominique and John de Menil did not blink. They understood exactly what Rothko was doing. He was not painting despair. He was painting the dark night of the soul, the via negativa, the terrifying, necessary, contemplative first step before any kind of spiritual rebirth. He was painting the reality of grief. He was painting the silence of their son's void. And in this, they would not and could not compromise. This was not a negotiation about aesthetics. It was a profound theological disagreement. The church wanted a space that gave you the answer. The de Menils and Rothko were building a space that forced you to ask the questions. In 1967, in another quiet, decisive act of immense power and wealth, they made their move. If the university would not accept this profound, difficult, modern statement of faith, then they would do it themselves. They severed the project from the university entirely. They bought a large plot of land 2 blocks away in a quiet, residential neighborhood. They would fund the entire massive and astronomically expensive project themselves. It would not be the St. Thomas Chapel. It would be simply the Rothko Chapel. It would be an independent, ecumenical, sacred space. It would belong to no one, and therefore, it would belong to everyone. For the next 2 years, Mark Rothko, now working in an almost frantic state of creation, poured his entire failing, tortured soul into the 14 monumental canvases that would be his final word. He was deeply sick. He was suffering from an aortic aneurysm that caused him constant pain. His marriage was collapsing. He was drinking heavily, and his paranoia and depression were becoming all-consuming. He was, in short, a man on the edge of his own abyss. But he worked. He referred to the paintings as his children, his passion. He was painting his own end. He created 2 great triptychs and 8 single monolithic panels. They are to this day overwhelming. They are not black. To call them black is to not have seen them. They are fields of deep, bruised, vibrating color. They are veils. They are deep, bloody maroons that absorb the light. They are dark, midnight purples. They are voids that seem to pull you in. They are not paintings you look at. They are paintings you experience. They are perhaps the most profound and terrifying statement on human tragedy, spirituality, and the search for meaning ever put to canvas in the 20th century. In 1969, the paintings were finished. They were created and shipped to Houston, where the chapel building was finally, at last, nearing completion. Rothko, however, was terrified. He was terrified of the final installation, terrified of how the light would hit them, terrified that he had failed. He was emptied. He had poured his entire soul into these canvases, and he had nothing left. On the 25th of February, 1970, Mark Rothko, age 66, was found dead on the floor of his kitchen in his New York studio. He had taken his own life, a brutal, desperate, and violent act. The news was a devastating psychic blow to Dominique and John. Their project, born from the grief of their lost son, was now baptized in the blood of its creator. The chapel was now doubly, triply haunted. It was no longer just a monument to Christoph's memory. It was now a memorial. It was the final tragic testament of their dead friend. Dominique's resolve in the face of this layered, compounded, almost operatic grief was absolute. It was the resolve of the Alsatian Protestant. It was the resolve of the mother who had lost her son. The project was no longer a commission. It was a sacred trust. She was no longer just the patron. She was the executor of Mark Rothko's soul. She and John took personal obsessive control of the final installation. And when the paintings were hung, they discovered a terrible final problem. The light was wrong. The single central skylight that Rothko had demanded was creating too much of the harsh Texas glare. It was washing out the subtle dark colors of the paintings. It was not creating contemplation, it was creating a distraction. Dominique was ruthless. This was not about what Rothko had wanted. It was about what his paintings needed. She had the skylight ripped out. A new, complex system of baffles and a new modulated skylight were designed. The light had to be perfect. It had to be his light, the light of his studio, the light in which the paintings were born. In 1971, 7 years after the commission, and 1 year after its artist's death, the Rothko Chapel finally opened its doors to the world. It was, and is, a stark, windowless, octagonal brick building. A bunker, a tomb, a womb. Inside there is no altar, no pulpit, no icons, just simple wooden benches, a bare floor, and the 14 massive, silent, brooding, and profoundly beautiful canvases. It is one of the most challenging and powerful public spaces ever built. It is not pretty. It is not uplifting in a simple, happy way. It is a difficult space. It is a space that does not give you answers. It forces you to ask the questions. It is a space that demands you confront your own sorrow, your own loneliness, your own void. For Dominique, it was the perfect, terrible, beautiful embodiment of her journey. She had taken the black hole of her son's death and the tragedy of her friend's suicide, and she had built a public, sacred space where the entire world could come and share in that darkness and perhaps find a flicker of their own light within it. She had turned her private grief into a universal gift. But the Rothko Chapel was not just a monument to the past, it was a statement of intent. It was the philosophical anchor for the next, and perhaps even more radical phase of her life. The chapel for Dominique was not an endpoint. It was the beginning. It was the fortress from which she would launch her quiet, determined, and revolutionary war on the world as she found it. The opening of the Rothko Chapel in 1971 was not just a cultural event. It was a profound declaration. Dominique de Menil, now in her 60s, had emerged from her decade of intense private grief, and she had brought something back with her. The chapel was a physical manifestation of her transformed philosophy. It was no longer enough to simply collect art. Art had to do something. It had to be a tool for social change. The chapel, in its quiet, brutalist, and uncompromising way, was a fortress of contemplation. And from this fortress, Dominique and John launched the next and perhaps most radical phase of their lives, a quiet, well-funded, and deeply intellectual war on the world's injustices. The grief for their son had not broken them. It had focused them. It had burned away any lingering frivolity and left them with a raw, unshakable sense of moral purpose. If the first half of their life was about art and faith, the second half was about art and justice. This shift was not abstract. It was immediate and deeply personal. The Rothko Chapel became, from its very first day, a global center for human rights. It was a place where art and activism were seen as two sides of the same coin. This was Dominique's vision, a space where the contemplation of a Rothko painting could fuel the determination to fight for a political prisoner. In 1973, just 2 years after the chapel opened, Dominique and John founded the Carter Menil Human Rights Foundation. They used the chapel as its spiritual heart. They began to award on a yearly basis the Rothko Chapel Award for commitment to truth and freedom. This was not a flashy, celebrity-driven prize. It was a serious, deeply researched, and often dangerous award, given to activists and organizations on the front lines of human rights battles around the world. They gave awards to political prisoners in South Africa, to dissenting writers in the Soviet Union, to activists in Latin America. Dominique, this slender, elegant, Parisian-born woman, was now directly confronting the apartheid regime, the KGB, and the military juntas of the world. She was using the immense global leverage of the Schlumberger fortune and the profound moral leverage of her institutions to shine a light into the darkest corners of the globe. She was, in her own quiet, indomitable way, as radical as any student protester, but instead of throwing bricks, she was commissioning art. This brings us to a crucial and often misunderstood aspect of her life, her relationship with her husband. It is too easy to see Dominique as the sole driving intellectual force, but the de Menil story is, at its heart, a partnership. It was a 50-year-long conversation. John was not just the husband, the banker who funded his wife's hobby. He was her intellectual and spiritual partner, a man of profound and complex vision in his own right. John was the Catholic mystic, the bon vivant, the man of worldly charm and deep intuitive feeling. Dominique was the Protestant logician, the analyst, the woman of austere intellectual rigor. He was the intuition, she was the intellect. He was the heart, she was the mind. And together they formed a single, complete, and formidable entity. While Dominique was the quiet, steady, analytical force, John was the passionate, charming, and often impulsive one. He was the one who would fall in love with an artist's work, and she was the one who would analyze its structure and find its place in their universe. Their collecting was a dialogue between his passion and her reason. And in the 1960s and 70s, their activism was the same. John, with his deep Catholic faith, was profoundly influenced by the Second Vatican Council, Vatican II, the revolutionary conference that sought to bring the Catholic Church into the modern world. He was also deeply, personally, and passionately engaged in the American civil rights movement. This was not a safe or fashionable hobby in 1960s Texas. Houston was, for all its economic ambition, a deeply segregated southern city. The white establishment, the oil barons and bankers the de Menils now lived among, were largely hostile to the idea of racial integration. John de Menil did not care. He and Dominique, guided by their shared philosophy that all men were created equal in the eyes of God, stepped directly into the fire. They used their money and their social standing at great personal risk to their reputation in their new city to support the cause. They brought civil rights leaders to Houston. They funded scholarships for black students. They commissioned studies. And they used their most powerful weapon, art. In 1969, as the Rothko Chapel was nearing completion, they conceived of another project, one that was just as radical. They decided to create an exhibition that would tackle, head-on, the history of racism. But they would do it in their way, not with political slogans, but with art. They began to fund and commission a vast, scholarly, multi-volume academic project that would trace the image of the black in Western art from antiquity to the modern day. This was a revolutionary act of scholarship. It was an attempt to decolonize art history, to look at the Western canon and ask, how have we seen and not seen our black brothers and sisters? This project, the image of the black in Western art, became a monumental, decades-long academic undertaking, one that has fundamentally reshaped the field of art history. It was a quiet, scholarly, and profoundly radical act of anti-racism. But they didn't just stop at scholarships. They wanted a public, visible statement. They began to collect African art, not as primitive artifacts, but as masterpieces of human creation, equal in spiritual and aesthetic power to any European painting. They amassed one of the greatest collections of African art in the world, and they made friends. John de Menil, in his work, sought out the most eloquent, powerful, and radical black voices in Houston. He found a young, charismatic politician named Mickey Leland. He befriended a passionate, brilliant activist named Judson Robinson. They didn't just fund them, they listened to them. They formed deep, personal, and transformative friendships. All of this, the civil rights work, the Human Rights Foundation, the art collecting, was happening at the same time. For Dominique, there was no separation. To buy a 14th century icon of the Virgin Mary, to commission a chapel from a suicidal Jewish painter, and to fund a voter registration drive in a black neighborhood were all the same act. They were all part of the same unified spiritual quest to find the divine, to heal a fractured world, and to honor the sacredness of every human soul. But this period of intense, shared public work was also a race against time. In 1973, the same year they founded their Human Rights Foundation, the second great tragedy of Dominique's life began. Her partner, her husband, her other half, John de Menil, was diagnosed with cancer. The next 5 years were a long, slow, and agonizing farewell. The disease ravaged his body, but his mind and his spirit remained incandescent. He and Dominique did not retreat. They accelerated. It was as if they both knew the clock was ticking. They worked with a frantic, focused energy, as if to complete a lifetime's worth of projects in the few years they had left. The scholarly work on the image of the black in Western art intensified. Their collecting became more focused. Their plans for the future became more ambitious. Dominique, the physicist, the logician, the woman who had nursed her mother through her final illness, now became her husband's primary caregiver. She, who had faced the void of her son's death, now had to face the slow, methodical, and visible process of loss. She had to watch the man she had loved for 50 years, the man who was the fire to her ice, slowly fade from the world. The emotional toll of this period is almost impossible to imagine. She was running a global human rights foundation, managing one of the world's most important art collections, and sitting by the bedside of her dying husband. And she did it all with her characteristic, almost terrifying, quiet composure. The uniform, the austere Balenciaga dress, the simple pearls, was her armor. The intellectual rigor was her defense. She poured her grief once again not into hysterics, but into work. On June 1st, 1973, John de Menil died. Dominique was 65 years old. Her son was gone. Her spiritual guide, Father Couturier, was long dead. Her great artist Rothko was gone. And now her partner, the man who had been the co-author of her entire life, was gone. The world that Dominique de Menil inhabited after 1978 was a profoundly silent one. She was 70 years old. Her husband, John, the man who had been the co-author of her entire life, was gone. The 50-year conversation that had fueled their collecting, their activism, and their spiritual quest had ended. To the outside world, especially to the art establishment in New York and the social world of Houston, her story was complete. She was the wealthy widow, the grand dame, the matriarch of a vast fortune and an even vaster art collection. The expectation was that she would now perform the final dignified role of her class, retirement. She would endow a wing at a major museum, perhaps, or sit on a few prestigious boards. She would become a keeper of the flame. The world had, once again, completely and totally underestimated Dominique de Menil. She was not at the end of her life's work. She was just entering her final and most astonishing act. The first 70 years, it turned out, had merely been the preparation. Now, alone with the full consolidated power of the Schlumberger fortune and their shared collection of over 10,000 masterpieces in her solitary, capable hands, she would build her true, lasting monument. She was no longer a partner. She was the sole architect, and she was about to build her masterpiece. Her entire life had been a search for a space that could house her philosophy. She had tried to find it in the university. She had built a piece of it with the Rothko Chapel. But now she would build the whole thing. She would create a home for the collection, a single place where the entire sprawling ecumenical conversation between eras and cultures, the dialogue she and John had spent a lifetime curating, could finally live and breathe. She decided to build a museum, but this in itself was a revolutionary act. In the 1970s and 80s, the museum world was in the grip of an edifice complex. It was the era of the starchitect, of the monumental statement. Museums were becoming grand, intimidating marble palaces designed to celebrate the architect, the donor, and the city. They were vast, often cold, and overwhelming spaces. Dominique despised this. She saw it as a profound betrayal of art. She believed that a museum should not be a monument. It should be an instrument for seeing, for thinking, for feeling. She did not want to build a palace to intimidate the public. She wanted to build a house to welcome them. She famously said, "I am an old woman. I have no time for the grand projects of presidents. I want a building that is not a monument." She began her search for an architect. The great famous names of the day were paraded before her. I. M. Pei, James Sterling, and others. She rejected them all. She found their work too noisy, too arrogant, too much about themselves. She was looking for someone who wasn't a star. She was looking for someone who was a poet of light. Her search became almost a legend. She was looking for an architect who understood humility. She found him in a 40-year-old, relatively unknown Italian architect working in Genoa, a man who had built very little, but who was obsessed with craftsmanship, technology, and above all, light. His name was Renzo Piano. This would be his very first American commission. It was an act of faith as profound as her commission to Rothko. She was, once again, bypassing the establishment and trusting her own, unerring, fiercely independent eye. She gave Piano a set of instructions that were not architectural, but philosophical. They were the culmination of her life's experience. First, she said, the museum must be small on the outside, but big on the inside. She did not want a massive, imposing facade that would loom over the quiet 1920s bungalow neighborhood she had chosen for her site. She wanted it to feel domestic, to feel like a part of the community. Second, it must feel like a home, not a temple. She wanted the materials to be simple, humble. She wanted the floors to be dark wood, like in her own Philip Johnson house, so they would recede and allow the art to float. She wanted the atmosphere to be one of intimacy. Third, and most importantly, she had a single, non-negotiable demand: natural light. This was her obsession. It was the great lesson she had learned from the tragedy of the Rothko Chapel. She had seen how the harsh, direct Texas sun could kill a painting, but she also knew that the cold, dead, artificial light of a traditional museum could kill its soul. She believed that art was a living thing, and it needed to live and breathe in the changing, temporal, living light of the real world. A painting, she felt, should look different in the morning than it does at dusk. It should look different on a cloudy day than on a sunny day. She gave Renzo Piano a seemingly impossible technical and poetic challenge. Find a way to filter the brutal Texas sun, to tame it, and to bring it inside so that it kisses the art but never burns it. For the next several years, Piano and his team worked on this single problem. They became, as he later said, obsessed with the light. They developed hundreds of prototypes, testing them on the Houston site. The result was an invention, a masterpiece of engineering and poetry that would change modern architecture. They created the leaf, a roof made of 300-foot-long, gracefully curved ferro-cement leaves, or fins. These structures, held up by a delicate, spidery cast-iron frame, were designed to do exactly what a tree does: dapple the light. They filter the high, hot, vertical sun, but allow the cooler, angled northern light to flow through the vast glass ceiling, bounce off the white leaves, and wash the galleries below in a soft, silvery, ever-changing, living illumination. The building itself was the perfect embodiment of Dominique's philosophy. It was a fusion of her two worlds. The technology was brilliant, a modern, industrial, scientific solution, the spirit of Schlumberger, but the effect was pure, mystical, and sacred, the spirit of Father Couturier. The Menil collection opened to the public in 1987. Dominique was 79 years old. It was the summation of her entire life. To walk into the Menil collection is not like walking into any other museum. It is an experience. First, you walk through a quiet residential neighborhood of gray-painted 1920s bungalows. The museum itself, low-slung, clad in gray cypress wood and white steel, feels like a large, elegant, and very quiet neighbor. There is no grand columned entrance, no marble staircase. You enter, almost humbly, from the side, and it is free. This was one of Dominique's most radical, non-negotiable demands. The museum would be free to the public forever. She believed that art was a right, not a privilege. It was a spiritual necessity like bread or water, and there should be no barrier, not even a small admission fee, between a person and that experience. Inside, the feeling is one of profound, shocking, and beautiful calm. The floors are dark, recycled pine. The light, that famous silvery light, falls from above. The building is silent. It is a village of art, as Piano called it, not a palace. It feels like a home. But the true genius, the final stunning revelation of Dominique's mind, is the art itself, the way it is hung. She rejected all traditional art historical dogma. She did not hang her collection by school or chronology. She did not create a French wing or a Renaissance gallery. Instead, she curated by feeling. She curated it by connection. She created a silent, visual, ecumenical dialogue, the very dialogue she and John had been having in their own home for 50 years. You turn a corner, and you are confronted with a breathtaking 13th century Byzantine icon of the Virgin Mary, its gold leaf glowing in the natural light, and hanging right next to it, sharing the same space, the same light, the same breathing room, is a vast abstract 1953 painting by Barnett Newman, a slash of red on a blue field. In another room, a row of ancient 6,000-year-old Cycladic idols, the very essence of minimalism, stares across the wooden floor at a 20th century masterpiece by Constantin Brancusi, a tribal primitive mask from Gabon, pulsing with spiritual power, is given the same space and reverence as a priceless painting by Cy Twombly. This is what she meant by art is the shortest path from man to man. She was forcing you to see the connections. She was forcing you to understand that the 13th century monk trying to capture the face of God and the 20th century abstract painter trying to capture the feeling of the sublime were on the exact same quest. She was dissolving time. She was dissolving geography. She was showing you the universal, unbroken 6,000-year-long thread of the human spirit. It is an experience that is closer to prayer than to visiting a museum. And she didn't stop. She was in her 80s, but her work was not finished. The Menil collection was the anchor, but she proceeded to build a campus, a neighborhood of contemplation. She bought up the surrounding bungalows, painted them all the same, distinctive Menil gray, and turned them into offices, archives, and libraries, creating a quiet academic village. She built another separate museum a few blocks away, the Cy Twombly Gallery. Another collaboration with Renzo Piano. It is a building of quiet, light-filled rooms dedicated to the work of a single difficult poetic artist. Then she acquired a nearby deconsecrated 1930s church and commissioned the minimalist artist Dan Flavin to create his final great work. The Dan Flavin installation at Richmond Hall is a building filled with nothing but colored fluorescent light, green, pink, blue, and yellow. It is a work of pure, transcendent, and joyous spirituality, a perfect, ecstatic counterbalance to the tragic, profound darkness of the Rothko Chapel just a few blocks away. She had created her own sacred campus, a pilgrimage site. In the middle of Houston, Texas, she had built a quiet, green, walkable neighborhood dedicated entirely to the contemplation of the human spirit, all of it free to the public. She did all of this alone, after the death of her husband, after the age of 70. She continued to live in her Philip Johnson house, surrounded by the art that was still in rotation. She continued to wear her uniform, the simple, elegant, severe dresses by Courrèges, her simple pearls. She was, to the end, a woman of profound, austere intellectual discipline. She was still always the physicist from the Sorbonne, the daughter of Alsatian Protestants. She had faced the great, chaotic, and tragic void of her son's death. She had confronted it in the darkness of the Rothko Chapel. And then, in her final act, she had built a response, a world of light, order, connection, and profound quiet and timeless beauty. Dominique de Menil died in 1997 on the last day of the year, at the age of 89. She had completed her work. The life of Dominique de Menil is a quiet, powerful, and profound counter-narrative to the 20th century story of power. She was a woman who was born into the loud power of industrial billionaire wealth, but she chose to wield it with a silence and a focus that was almost monastic. Her story is a testament to the fact that you do not have to be a swan to be a woman of influence. She was not a socialite, a muse, or a follower of fashion. She was a creator, a scholar, and a philosopher. She proved that the mind could be as powerful and as transformative as the spectacle of beauty. In a world obsessed with fame, she chose anonymity. When her museum opened, she famously insisted, "My name is on the building. It is a name, not a person." She refused to tell the story. She wanted the art to be the story. Her life is also a profound, moving, and deeply human lesson in the alchemy of grief. She took the most profound loss a human can experience, the random, meaningless death of a child, and she did not let it destroy her. She did not hide from it. Instead, she stared directly into that void, and she spent the next 40 years building beautiful, sacred, and public spaces where the rest of the world could, in their own time, confront their own. The Rothko Chapel is her grief made public and universal. The Menil collection is her answer to that grief. It is her life's argument laid out in wood, light, and canvas, that life is tragic and chaotic, but that the human spirit in its constant 6,000-year quest for meaning is beautiful, unbroken, and divine. She was not a collector in the modern sense of the word, an investor buying assets. She was perhaps the last of the great true patrons. She was in the tradition of the Medici or of the popes. She did not just buy art, she commissioned it. She willed it into existence. She entered into a true, deep, and often difficult partnership with the artist she believed in, and she gave it all away. Her legacy is not the things she owned, it is the way she made the world see them. She created a new way to look at art, a new kind of museum, a new kind of public space. In the end, Dominique de Menil's life was a single, coherent, and beautiful argument. She argued that art is not a luxury, not a decoration, and not an investment. She proved that art is a fundamental spiritual necessity, as vital to the human soul as bread, water, or faith. She took the great chaotic forces of her life, the exile from war, the raw capitalist energy of Texas, the profound, unendurable void of her son's death, and she did not break. She responded. She, the physicist, imposed a new kind of order on the world, a world of silence, of meaning, and of light. She was not a Swan. She was not a socialite. She was a philosopher, a secular abbess, a woman of quiet, terrifying, and profound strength. She was the patroness who turned her own, private, devastating faith into a public, healing, and lasting art. And she left the doors open for all of us forever, for free,